Lady, this dirt's been dead longer than your husband.
Then you won't mind if I use it.
Every farmer on that road said the same thing. Walk away.
Prescott, tell her what happens to squatters on condemned land.
This land isn't condemned. And it isn't yours.
Ma'am, the county survey is filed. This is over.
She didn't argue. She walked into the dead trees with a bag. By October, they stopped laughing. Margaret folded the letter. Didn't crumple it, didn't tear it. Just folded it once along the crease, slid it into the breast pocket of her faded olive green canvas ranch coat, and turned back toward the farmhouse without another word. Drake watched her go, still smiling. That soft, doughy face with the weak chin tilted up like he'd just closed the sweetest deal of his career. His white smartphone glinted in his right hand. His charcoal gray overcoat didn't have a single wrinkle. Not one. The man had driven 40 minutes on a gravel road and looked like he'd stepped out of a catalog. He was still smiling when Margaret's screen door closed behind her. He wouldn't be smiling by Friday. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. 11 months earlier. The Hollis place sat on 340 acres of rolling grassland along the upper bend of the Judith River in Pryor County, Montana. Not flashy land, not the kind that ends up in magazines. Just honest, wind-beaten country that did what you asked if you respected it, and punished you quick if you didn't. Margaret Hollis respected it. Every morning at 5:15, she pulled on those scuffed tan leather work boots, laced them tight over dark brown corduroy trousers, and walked the north pasture fence line before the sun cleared the ridge. 47 head of Angus cross. She knew each one by face, knew which ones drifted toward the creek in July and which ones hugged the tree line when the wind came down from the snowies. She'd run this herd alone for 11 years now, since her husband Ray passed, and she hadn't lost a single calf to neglect. Not one. Tuesdays and Thursdays, she drove the 12 miles into Judith Gap to keep books for the Mussel Shell Feed Cooperative. Ledgers, invoices, fuel receipts. She did it by hand in a composition notebook and then entered the numbers into the co-op's ancient desktop computer, and her numbers were always right. Always. The manager once joked that Margaret Hollis was the only person in the county who could make a spreadsheet feel ashamed of itself. She didn't laugh. She just nodded and kept writing. Sundays were different. Sundays she walked out behind the barn to the small iron-fenced plot where 3 headstones stood in a row under a cottonwood tree. Her husband Ray on the right, her father Walter in the middle, and on the left, the oldest stone, its edges soft from a century of weather, Edwin Hollis, her grandfather. She'd set a hand on Edwin's stone every Sunday. Didn't speak, didn't pray exactly, just stood there with her silver-white hair pulled back in that low ponytail, wisps loose around her temples, her pale gray-blue eyes fixed on the inscription. Born 1889, died 1961. Below that, a single line Walter had insisted on. He surveyed the line and held it. Most people in Pryor County had no idea what that meant. Edwin Hollis had homesteaded this land in 1924, but before he was a farmer, he was a railroad surveyor for the Milwaukee Road. Spent 6 years walking corridors through central Montana with a transit and a chain, marking grades, plotting water crossings, documenting every spring and tributary the rail line would need. The railroad paid him in knowledge as much as wages. He learned where the water was. He learned who owned it. He learned how ownership got recorded and, more importantly, how it got lost. Then he quit the railroad, filed his homestead claim, and never left. That detail, Edwin the surveyor, had faded from local memory like old fence paint. Nobody talked about it. Nobody cared. He was just Margaret's grandfather, a name on a headstone behind a barn. That was about to matter more than anyone in Pryor County could imagine. The first sign of trouble came in March when a company called Ridgeline Infrastructure LLC started buying parcels along the Judith River corridor. Quiet purchases, no press releases, no town halls, just a man in a charcoal overcoat showing up at kitchen tables with a folder and a number. Weston Drake. He bought the Fergus place first, 200 acres of hay ground, assessed at $410,000. Drake's people got the county to reclassify it as flood-prone agricultural reserve, which collapsed the assessed value to $91,000. Then Ridgeline offered $105,000, and old Pete Fergus, who was 79 and tired, took it. Then the Arndt parcel, then the Kessler quarter section, then the Morrison Ranch. 11 properties in 4 months, all following the same pattern: reclassify, collapse the value, purchase for pennies. Margaret watched it happen from her kitchen window. She could see the Fergus place from there, or what used to be the Fergus place. Survey flags appeared along its fence line in April, orange plastic snapping in the wind like little warnings nobody was reading. She remembered something her father Walter told her once, sitting at this same kitchen table, his coffee going cold. He'd been repeating something Edwin had told him, and his voice had gone serious in a way that made a young Margaret set down her fork. "If they ever come for the water," Walter had said, "check the original pins." She'd asked what that meant. He shook his head, said he wasn't entirely sure himself, said Edwin kept everything in boxes and that one day it would matter, and she'd know when. Standing at that window now, watching the orange survey flags multiply across the valley like a rash, Margaret knew. She started in the attic that evening. The space above the farmhouse was low-ceilinged and smelled like pine dust and mouse droppings. Boxes everywhere. Old leather folios cracked along the spines. Drawers pulled from the desk that no longer existed, stuffed with yellowed papers. Tax receipts from 1947. A livestock bill of sale from 1953, a handwritten letter from the Milwaukee Road dated 1921. She read everything, sorted it into piles on the attic floor, went back up the next night and did it again, and the next. Most of it was ordinary: farm records, correspondence, a life in paper. But in the far corner, behind a rolled carpet and a broken rocking chair, she found what she hadn't known she was looking for. She pulled the last box from the attic, a locked steel toolbox with Edwin's initials stamped into the brass latch. She carried it down to the kitchen table and set it under the light. Margaret sets the steel toolbox on the kitchen table under the overhead light and works the brass latch open with a flathead screwdriver. The latch doesn't want to give. Decades of corrosion have fused the brass against the steel, and she has to lean her full weight into the handle, her thick forearms tensing, the faded olive-green canvas of her ranch coat pulling tight across her broad shoulders. The screwdriver slips twice. She adjusts her grip, tries again. The latch pops with a sound like a rifle bolt. She lifts the lid. Inside, layered beneath a fold of waxed canvas and a brittle rubber band that crumbles at her touch, is a single sheet of heavy drafting paper. Cream-colored, brown at the edges, folded twice into quarters. She unfolds it carefully, pressing the creases flat against the table with the heel of her palm. It's a hand-drawn survey map. Edwin Hollis's name is written in the upper left corner in tight, precise block letters. Beneath it, a date, March 14th, 1923. 1 year before the homestead filing. The lines are clean, ruled with an engineer's straight edge, and the coordinate notations along the boundary are written in a hand Margaret recognizes from her grandfather's other papers. The hand of a railroad surveyor. Edwin had worked the Northern Pacific Line before he ever filed his claim. He knew how to measure land the way most men knew how to saddle a horse. This wasn't some rough sketch on the back of an envelope. This was professional work. Compass bearings, elevation markers, township and range designations cross-referenced against a benchmark Edwin had driven into a limestone outcrop near the river. Every line, every number, placed with the kind of precision that doesn't leave room for interpretation. Margaret stares at it for a long time. The overhead light hums. A moth taps against the bulb. Then she walks to the living room, pulls open the bottom drawer of the old filing cabinet beside the wood stove, and takes out her county tax plat. The one the assessor's office mailed her every year. The one she'd used to pay property taxes on 340 acres for the last 4 decades. She lays both documents side by side on the kitchen table. The boundary lines don't match. Not even close. Edwin's 1923 survey shows the eastern edge of the Hollis property extending well past the tree line, down the slope, all the way to a section of riverbank Margaret had always assumed was county land. The tax plat shows the boundary stopping a good distance west of that, up the hill, back behind the cottonwoods. The difference isn't subtle. It isn't a matter of a few fence posts. The Hollis land, according to Edwin's survey, extends much further east toward the river than anything the county has ever acknowledged. Margaret's pale gray-blue eyes move between the two documents. Back and forth. Back and forth. She doesn't say a word. She folds both documents, slides them into a manila envelope, and sets her alarm for 5 in the morning. The drive to Billings takes just under 3 hours. Margaret parks her truck on a side street off North Broadway, in front of a narrow 2-story brick building with a faded brass plaque beside the door that reads, Sutter Land, Title, and Property Law. She walks in carrying the manila envelope and the dented steel toolbox with the brass latch. Gene Sutter meets her in the front office. He's a wiry man in his early 60s, lean as a fence rail, with a long, narrow face and prominent cheekbones that catch the fluorescent light. His thin, sandy gray hair is parted neatly on the left, trimmed short above the ears. Round, tortoiseshell reading glasses sit low on his nose, and he peers over them the way a librarian looks at a late return. He's wearing a rumpled tan corduroy blazer over a light blue chambray button-down, khaki chinos with a brown leather belt, and worn brown suede desert boots that have seen better decades. A weathered brown leather document tube hangs from a strap slung over his left shoulder, like he's been halfway out the door since 1997 and just never quite left. Gene Sutter is not flashy. He doesn't advertise. He doesn't chase ambulances or shake hands at fundraisers. What Gene Sutter does is read land records. He reads them the way some people read scripture, slowly, carefully, with the understanding that a single misplaced word can change everything. Margaret sets the manila envelope on his desk. She tells him about Ridgeline, about the signs, about the surveyors on the ridge with their orange vests and their laser equipment, about the letter offering her $210,000 for land her family has held for a century. Gene listens with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture slightly stooped at the shoulders. He doesn't interrupt. When she's done, he sits down, pulls the 2 documents from the envelope, and lays them flat under his desk lamp. Then he goes to work. He pulls the county's official plat records first, the current ones, filed with the Yellowstone County Clerk. He lays them beside Edwin's 1923 survey and traces the boundary lines with the tip of a mechanical pencil, not marking, just following. His hazel-green eyes narrow behind the tortoiseshell frames. The discrepancy is there, clear as daylight. The Hollis property boundary, according to Edwin's original survey, extends 1,400 feet further east than the county's records show. 1,400 feet. That's not a rounding error. That's not a smudged ink line on a photocopy. That's nearly a 1/4 mile of land. Jean pulls the original 1924 General Land Office filing next, the Federal Homestead Patent, the document that actually created the Hollis property as a legal entity. He finds it in a digitized archive, cross-references the coordinate notations against Edwin's survey, and sits back in his chair. Edwin's coordinates match the federal patent exactly. Every bearing, every benchmark, every decimal point. The county's 1951 resurvey, the one that became the basis for every tax plat, every assessor's map, every boundary reference for the next 70-plus years, transposed 2 digits in a single coordinate, swapped a 47 for a 74. And that one clerical error shifted the entire eastern boundary of the Hollis property 1,400 feet to the west. 1,400 feet that included the exact section of riverbank where Ridgeline Resources plans to build its primary water intake structure. The intake pipe, the pumping station, the filtration array, the whole $90 million spine of their operation. Without that water, the facility doesn't function. Period. It's not a nice to have. It's the entire circulatory system of the project. Gene Sutter sets down his pen, looks at Margaret across the desk, and says, "Their entire intake permit is built on land they don't control. Every approval, every easement, every environmental study, all of it references a boundary that doesn't exist." Margaret sat across from Gene in his Billings office and asked one question. "If I file a correction now, what happens to their project?" Gene Sutter leaned back in his chair, his tortoiseshell reading glasses sliding down the bridge of his thin nose. He folded his hands behind his back, even while seated, the way he always did when he was thinking through something that mattered. "Everything stops," he said. "Every permit Ridgeline holds references that boundary. The water intake easement, the environmental study, the construction authorization from the county, all of it hangs on a survey line that puts their access point on public land. You file the correction, the state land office flags the discrepancy, and every single approval goes into administrative freeze. Could take 6 months just to sort out the paperwork. Could take longer." He said it the way a surgeon describes a procedure. Clinical. Certain. Margaret didn't move. Her pale gray-blue eyes stayed fixed on the weathered brown leather document tube leaning against Gene's desk, the one holding 60 years of her family's history. "Prepare the filing," she said, "but don't submit it." Gene's eyebrows lifted a 1/4 inch. That was a lot for him. "Not yet," Margaret said, and that single word changed everything. See, most people, most normal, reasonable people, would have pulled the trigger right there. You've got the proof. You've got the lawyer. You've got a billion-dollar company building on ground they don't legally control. You file the correction, you freeze their permits, you watch them scramble. That's the play. But Margaret Hollis wasn't playing a hand. She was setting a trap. Her reasoning was simple, and it was brutal. Right now, Ridgeline had exposure. They had plans and permits and a shiny announcement nobody outside of Montana had heard about. If she froze them today, they'd lose some money, hire some lawyers, reroute the project, and move on. Weston Drake would shrug it off, adjust his spreadsheet, and find another river to drain. The damage would sting, but it wouldn't cripple. Margaret wanted cripple. She wanted the county locked in. She wanted signed contracts. She wanted public funds committed, construction equipment on the ground, press coverage, investor presentations, environmental bonds posted. She wanted Ridgeline and every politician attached to them buried so deep in this project that backing out would cost more than going forward. And going forward would be impossible. So she waited. And while she waited, she started pulling on the thread Jean had found. Because that boundary reclassification on her property wasn't an accident. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a pattern. Jean's research had turned up something ugly along the Judith River corridor. Over the previous 18 months, the Pryor County Assessor's Office had quietly reclassified parcels belonging to 11 different landowners. 11. Every single one of them held river frontage property upstream or downstream of the proposed Ridgeline facility site. Every single reclassification shifted boundary lines, reduced assessed values, and, here's the part that should make your blood boil, created gaps of so-called public land exactly where Ridgeline needed easement access. 11 families, exposed to the same scheme. Most of them had no idea what had happened to their property lines. They just knew their land values had cratered, and some company was offering to buy at prices that felt like charity. 2 of them had already sold. Margaret found them, drove to their homes herself, her scuffed tan work boots on their porches, the faint crescent-shaped birthmark on her neck visible above her collar as she stood in their doorways and asked quiet questions. First was Dale Crenshaw, 62, who'd ranched 400 acres along the Judith for 30 years. His assessed value dropped 40% in 1 quarter. No explanation, no appeal notice, just a letter and a new number. Ridgeline offered him $310,000 for land worth twice that. He took it because his wife needed surgery and the bank wouldn't lend against the new valuation. Second was Ruth Engel. Same story, different numbers, same result. Reclassification, collapsed value. A low-ball offer that showed up within weeks of the new assessment, like someone had been watching the mailbox. Both of them confirmed the same thing. The county assessor's office initiated the reclassification. Nobody requested it. Nobody challenged their existing boundaries. It just happened. Margaret drove back to a ranch with their statements written out on yellow legal pad paper and signed at the bottom. She put them in the dented steel toolbox with the brass latch and set it on her kitchen table next to the original 1963 survey. Then she sat down and waited some more. She didn't have to wait long. Ridgeline announced the full scope of the project in late September. $90 million. A state-of-the-art water treatment and distribution facility serving 3 counties, anchored by a 20-year service contract with the Pryor County Commission. Drake's face was everywhere. Interviews with the Billings Gazette, a segment on the local NBC affiliate, a glossy press release with drone footage of the river corridor. In every shot, his dark brown hair was combed back slick with product, his wireframe gold-rimmed glasses catching the light, his chin tilted up like he was posing for a damn monument. "This is what happens when the private sector and local government work together," Drake told a reporter, his white smartphone resting on the table in front of him like a scepter. "We're bringing infrastructure, jobs, and long-term water security to a region that, frankly, has been neglected for decades." Neglected. He said neglected. About a place where families like Margaret's had been managing water rights since before his father was born. The county commission voted unanimously to commit $14 million in public matching funds. Construction permits were issued, environmental bonds were posted, contracts were signed with 3 separate engineering firms. Equipment began arriving on flatbed trucks along Route 87. Every dollar they spent was another brick in the wall Margaret was building around them. And then came the ceremony. First week of November. Ridgeline broke ground on the water treatment facility with a public event, a temporary stage, a podium with the company logo. The county commission chair shook Drake's hand in front of cameras while Drake smiled that soft, satisfied smile of a man who believed he'd already won. Margaret watched the local news report from her kitchen. The toolbox sat on the table beside her. The brass latch caught the light from the screen. She watched Drake's face. She watched the handshake. She watched the shovels bite into dirt that wasn't theirs. Then she turned off the television. 3 months after the cameras left and the champagne dried on Ridgeline's groundbreaking stage, a white county truck pulled up Margaret Hollis's gravel drive. A man in a polo shirt stepped out carrying a clipboard and a manila envelope. He didn't knock. He taped the envelope to a front door, walked back to the truck, and left. Margaret found it 20 minutes later when she came in from checking fence line. Her silver-white hair was loose at the temples from the wind, wisps curling against the faint crescent birthmark below her left ear. She peeled the envelope off the door, read it, standing right there on the porch. Reclassification notice. 158 of her 160 acres had been redesignated as unusable floodplain. 158 out of 160. They left her the house and roughly 2 acres around it. Everything else, the pasture, the creek bottom, the North Ridge where her grandfather had run cattle since 1923, was now, according to Pryor County, a flood zone. Worthless on paper, untouchable for agriculture, uninsurable, unsellable. And here's the thing. Margaret wasn't surprised, not even a little, because she'd watched it happen 11 times before. 11 properties, 11 families, every single one of them bordering the same corridor ridgeline needed for pipeline access and treatment infrastructure. The Dawsons lost 212 acres to the same reclassification in January. The Muellers lost 91 in March. Old Carl Pemberton, 86 years old, been on that land since Eisenhower, lost 140 acres in a single afternoon. Same clipboard, same manila envelope, same county truck pulling away before anyone could ask a question. 11 small noises. 1 catastrophic pattern. Every reclassification followed the same formula. County assessor shows up. Floodplain designation appears out of nowhere. Property value craters to nothing. And then, like clockwork, the condemnation notice arrives. Margaret's came 9 days later. Eminent domain. The county was seizing her entire 160 acres for public infrastructure purposes related to water treatment and distribution. Total compensation offered? $4,200. $4,200 for 160 acres of Montana ranch land. That's $26.25 per acre. Land that had appraised at $1,800 an acre just 2 years prior. Land her family had worked for a century. Land that Ridgeline's own internal projections valued at over $3 million for pipeline routing alone. $4,200. She could almost hear Weston Drake's voice in the number. That smug, soft-bodied son of a bitch with his slicked-back hair and his white smartphone, standing in some boardroom 200 miles away, chin tilted up, weight on his heels, saying something like, "Offer her whatever. She's an old woman on a dead ranch. She'll take it because she doesn't have a choice." That's how they all talked about her. About all of them. The ranchers, the holdouts, the people who'd been on this land before Ridgeline was a line item on a venture capital spreadsheet. Disposable. Invisible. Too old and too rural to fight back. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with the condemnation paperwork spread in front of her. She read every word. Not skimming, not panicking. Reading the way Gene Sutter had taught her to read, slowly, with a pencil, circling every reference, every citation, every legal description. And there it was. Page 4, paragraph 9, subsection C. The legal description of the property being condemned referenced the county's 1951 survey boundary. The same boundary. The exact same erroneous line that Gene had identified months ago in his office, hunched over that weathered brown leather document tube with his tortoiseshell glasses low on his nose. The 1951 survey had placed the eastern edge of Margaret's property 63 feet west of where it actually sat, according to the original 1887 federal patent. 63 feet, that shifted the entire parcel's legal description into a different section, a section the county didn't have jurisdiction to condemn. Every document in the condemnation chain, the floodplain assessment, the reclassification, the eminent domain filing, all of it built on the same cracked foundation, the same wrong line on the same wrong map. Margaret set the pencil down, picked up her keys and her dented steel toolbox with the brass latch — she never went anywhere without it — and drove 19 miles to Gene Sutter's office. Gene was at his desk when she walked in. Rumpled tan corduroy blazer, light blue chambray shirt, the cluster of 3 freckles near his left temple catching the late afternoon light through the window. He looked up, saw the papers in her hand, and his hazel-green eyes went still behind those round tortoise-shell frames. Margaret laid the condemnation notice on his desk without a word. Gene read it, turned to page 4, found paragraph 9, found subsection C. And for the first time in the months Margaret had known him, the man smiled. "They committed," he said. "They put it in writing." That's all he needed to say. Here's what Drake and his lawyers at Ridgeline didn't understand. You can get away with a lot when your paperwork is vague, when your surveys are approximate, when your legal descriptions leave enough room to adjust. But the moment you file a formal condemnation, the moment you commit the county's legal authority to a specific boundary, a specific parcel description, a specific survey, you've locked yourself in. You've told a court, under oath, this is the land and this is our authority to take it. And if that boundary is wrong, if the survey it's built on has been wrong since 1951, then every document in the chain doesn't just weaken. It collapses. The assessment is void. The reclassification is void. The eminent domain filing is void. You can't condemn land you don't control. You can't seize property that isn't where you say it is. Gene explained all of this standing at his desk, hands clasped behind his back, speaking in that measured, unhurried way of his. Margaret listened with her shoulders squared and her pale gray-blue eyes locked on his. Once we file the boundary correction with the state, their entire legal position unravels. Every document, every filing, every acre they think they've taken from 11 families. 11 families. Not just Margaret. All of them. Margaret called Gene that evening and said 2 words. "File it." Gene submitted the boundary correction to the Montana Department of Natural Resources the next morning. The bulldozer arrived at Margaret's gate on a Tuesday morning. Big yellow Caterpillar, fresh off a flatbed, diesel exhaust curling into the cold Montana air like a promise nobody asked for. Behind it, a white SUV with tinted windows. The door swung open and out stepped Weston Drake, charcoal overcoat pressed crisp, collar open, chin tilted at that angle only a man who's never been told no can manage. His white smartphone was already in his right hand. He was smiling. Margaret was already standing at the gate, silver white hair pulled back in that low ponytail, wisps loose at her temples. The faded olive-green canvas coat, scuffed tan boots planted in the gravel like she'd grown there. She held a single sheet of paper in front of her, arm extended, steady as fence wire. 5 words. You surveyed the wrong land. Drake laughed. Not a chuckle, a full, chest-puffed, weight-on-his-heels laugh, the kind designed to make someone feel small. He started ticking off fingers. Licensed survey firm, county board approval, state ratification of the condemnation order, environmental clearance signed by 3 separate agencies. He said the words like he was reading a bedtime story to someone who couldn't keep up. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, and the way he said it dripped with the particular condescension of a man who thinks age and gender are the same as weakness. You've got 48 hours to vacate. After that, the county marshal does it for you. I'd start packing if I were you. Maybe call one of your grandkids to help with the heavy lifting. Like she was furniture, like she was an inconvenience with a heartbeat. Margaret folded the letter, one clean crease. She slid it into the breast pocket of her flannel shirt, turned around and walked back toward the house. Didn't look over her shoulder. Didn't say another word. The crescent-shaped birthmark on her neck caught the morning light as she turned, and that was the last thing Drake saw before the screen door closed behind her. He was still smiling. Son of a bitch was still smiling. 2 days later, Ridgeline Capital's attorneys filed an emergency motion to enforce the condemnation. Lead counsel Prescott, tall, jet-black hair swept back in that clean side part, navy three-piece suit, Mont Blanc pen clipped to the breast pocket like a medal, drafted it personally. The motion cited imminent construction deadlines, sunk costs exceeding $14 million, and the public benefit of a regional water infrastructure project. The filing was tight, professional, confident. Hearing set for Friday morning in Pryor County District Court. They wanted this done fast, before anyone could look too closely. Friday came cold, frost on the courthouse steps, the kind of morning where your breath hangs in front of you like a question mark. Margaret walked through the double doors at 8:47. Olive green coat, cream flannel underneath. Her dented steel toolbox was not with her today. Instead, Gene Sutter walked beside her, slightly stooped at the shoulders, round tortoiseshell glasses low on his nose, and slung over his left shoulder was that weathered brown leather document tube. One tube. One exhibit. That's all they brought. Ridgeline brought 6 attorneys, 4 bankers' boxes of filings, and Prescott at the helm. Drake sat in the gallery behind them, charcoal overcoat folded across his lap, white phone already glowing in his right hand. The small dark freckle on his cheekbone caught the overhead fluorescence. He looked bored. He looked like a man waiting for a formality. Prescott stood first, sharp, pale blue eyes sweeping the courtroom. He presented the county survey with the smooth confidence of someone who'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. The assessment, the condemnation order, every document stamped, notarized, cross-referenced. He laid it out like a closing argument before the case had even started. Clean lines, no gaps. Or so he thought. Gene Sutter stood, slowly. The way a man stands when he knows exactly what he's about to do and isn't in any hurry to do it. He unslung the leather tube from his shoulder, uncapped it, and unrolled Edwin Hollis's 1923 survey onto the exhibit table. Hand-drawn, precise. Ink lines that had survived 100 Montana winters. The coordinates matched the federal homestead patent to the foot. Every benchmark, every section marker, every water feature, plotted by a man who understood that land wasn't just dirt. It was law. Then Gene laid down the General Land Office homestead filing, original, authenticated, and beside it, a modern licensed survey completed just 11 days prior, confirming Edwin's boundary lines exactly, to the foot. A century apart, 2 surveys, same answer. Gene adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses. The cluster of 3 freckles near his left temple was visible under the courtroom lights. His voice was quiet, measured. He didn't need volume. He identified the transposition error, 2 digits, reversed in the county's 1951 resurvey. A simple clerical mistake, the kind that sits in a filing cabinet for 70 years because nobody ever checks. Section 16 became Section 61. A strip of land along the Judith River shifted on paper by almost a quarter mile. And every single permit Ridgeline Capital held, the facility permit, the environmental clearance, the water intake easement. All of them referenced the 1951 boundaries. All of them referenced Margaret's land. Not ridge lines, not the county's. Margaret Hollis's land, deeded through an unbroken chain going back to a federal homestead patent signed by the President of the United States. Prescott was on his feet before Jean finished. Objection. This survey has not been submitted through proper discovery channels. This is a delay tactic from a party with no standing to... The judge overruled him. One word. Flat. Overruled. Drake, sitting in the gallery, pulled out his white phone and started texting. Right there. In open court. Thumbs moving fast, the glow reflecting off his wireframe gold-rimmed glasses, that self-satisfied lean still in his posture like he hadn't heard a damn thing. The judge watched him do it. Then the judge spoke. The condemnation was frozen, effective immediately. An independent boundary survey was ordered at Ridgeline's expense, and a temporary restraining order was issued blocking all construction activity within 2,000 feet of the disputed strip. The restraining order hits Ridgeline's construction site like a power outage. Within 24 hours, every piece of heavy equipment along the Judith River corridor goes silent. And I mean silent. 3 excavators, 2 concrete batch plants, a 60-ton crane that had been swinging steel beams over the river like toothpicks. All of it frozen mid-motion, locked down, keys pulled. The diesel generators that had been humming around the clock for weeks went cold. Fuel trucks turned around on the access road. Porta-johns stopped getting serviced. By Wednesday morning, the only sound on that construction corridor was the Judith River itself, doing what it had always done, running clean and steady over Margaret Hollis's land. Ridgeline's contractors didn't even argue. Their foreman read the court order, looked at each other, and started covering equipment with tarps. These guys had been around long enough to know what a 2,000-foot buffer meant. It meant everything. The water intake structure, the pump house foundation, the primary access road to the resort's western wing, all of it fell inside that radius. All of it sat on dirt that a judge had just said might not belong to Ridgeline at all. The independent survey team arrived 11 days later. 3 licensed surveyors out of Helena, appointed by the court, carrying no loyalty to anyone. They brought GPS equipment accurate to the centimeter. They brought the original 1923 GLO plat that Edwin Hollis had filed with the county. They brought the 1951 county assessor's worksheet, the one with the transposed coordinates that Gene Sutter had already flagged. It took them 3 weeks. They walked every inch of that river frontage. They drove steel pins. They shot laser lines. They cross-referenced monument markers that had been sitting in the ground since before Montana had paved highways. And when they finished, their report was 12 pages long and absolutely devastating. Edwin Hollis's original boundary lines were correct, down to the foot. The county's 1951 reclassification had shifted the western boundary of the Hollis parcel 62 feet east, shaving off a strip of river frontage that had belonged to the family since 1923. The surveyors didn't speculate about why. They didn't have to. The numbers spoke for themselves, and the numbers said Margaret Hollis owned every inch of the ground where Ridgeline's water intake structure was currently half built. That 12-page report landed on 3 desks simultaneously: Gene Sutter's desk, Prescott's desk, and the desk of the County Development Authority director, who suddenly had a very different kind of problem. Because here's where it gets really ugly for everyone who isn't Margaret. Ridgeline's entire $90 million resort project depended on permitted water access from the Judith River. Their engineering plans, their environmental permits, their financing, all of it was built around that specific intake point on that specific stretch of riverbank. You can't just move a water intake structure upstream a quarter mile and call it a day. That requires new permits, new environmental impact studies, new geological surveys, 18 months of paperwork minimum. Their construction loans had interest clocks ticking at $47,000 a day. Every day that site sat silent, Ridgeline bled money like a stuck hog. And Weston Drake? Oh, Weston Drake was having the worst month of his miserable career. The County Development Authority's reclassification pattern, the one Gene had documented across 11 properties over 4 decades, was now a matter of public court record. Local journalists started pulling files. A reporter from the Billings Gazette made 3 open records requests in a single week. The pattern was undeniable. 11 rural properties along the Judith River corridor, all reclassified between 1951 and 2019, all shifting boundaries in ways that happened to benefit commercial development interests. Some of those reclassifications had Drake's signature on them. Some predated him. But the recent ones, the ones that mattered, had his fingerprints all over them. Drake's phone stopped being answered, not by choice. The county attorney's office advised him to stop communicating with Ridgeline directly. His office door stayed closed. That white smartphone he always kept in his right hand, the one he'd been texting on in the courtroom like he owned the place, sat face down on his desk now, buzzing with calls he couldn't take. The man who'd leaned back on his heels with his chin raised and his chest puffed, who'd told Margaret her land was worth whatever the county said it was worth, who'd looked at a 68-year-old woman in a faded olive green ranch coat and seen nothing but an obstacle to be bulldozed, that man was now an obstacle himself. And nobody was returning his calls either. Funny how that works. Prescott made the call on a Tuesday. Gene Sutter answered on the second ring. He was standing in Margaret's kitchen at the time, his weathered brown leather document tube leaning against the counter, his round tortoiseshell glasses pushed low on his nose as he reviewed the surveyor's final report one more time. Prescott's voice was different. The practiced authority was gone. The military straight posture you could somehow hear through the phone, gone. What came through the line was a man in a tailored navy blue suit sitting in a conference room full of people who were all looking at him to fix something he couldn't fix. "What does she want?" Prescott asked. 4 words. No preamble, no threat, no mention of eminent domain or fair market value or the county's authority to do a damn thing. Just 4 words that admitted, without saying it, that Margaret Hollis held every card at the table. Gene didn't answer right away. He looked across the kitchen at Margaret, who was sitting at her table with her hands clasped in front of her, silver white hair pulled back in that low ponytail, pale, gray-blue eyes steady. The dented steel toolbox with the brass latch sat on the floor beside her chair, same as always. She gave one small nod. Gene gives Ridgeline one number. $6.2 million. The appraised fair market value of the strip based on its commercial utility to the project, plus a permanent conservation easement on the remaining acreage that prevents future condemnation. Prescott asks for 72 hours. Gene gives him 48. Ridgeline's board approves the deal within 48 hours. Every single board member votes yes. They don't even discuss it. No counter. No negotiation. No, let's see if she'll take 4. No, what if we offer stock options, or maybe we can structure a leaseback? None of that. The vote is unanimous and it takes 11 minutes. 11 minutes for a $6.2 million payout to a woman they spent 2 years trying to erase from her own land. Prescott calls Gene Sutter before the ink on the board resolution is dry. His voice is flat. Professional. The sharp, pale blue eyes, the military posture, the Mont Blanc pen clipped to that breast pocket, all of it still intact. But the fight is gone. You can hear it. A man who bills $900 an hour doesn't call to negotiate when the number's already been accepted. He calls because he lost. and he wants it over fast. Jean listens, says thank you, hangs up. Then he calls Margaret. She signs the papers at Jean's office on a Tuesday afternoon, second week of October. The light through his window is that low autumn gold that makes everything look like a photograph. Jean's got his tortoiseshell reading glasses pushed low on his nose, the weathered brown leather document tube leaning against his desk. Margaret sits across from him in her faded olive green canvas coat, cream flannel underneath, her silver white hair pulled back in that low ponytail with the wisps loose around her temples. The dented steel toolbox with the brass latch sits on the floor beside her chair. She reads every page, every single one. Jean doesn't rush her. Nobody rushes her anymore. The conservation easement is recorded alongside the sale. Her remaining acreage, the house, the barn, the upper pastures, the family cemetery on the hill, none of it can ever be condemned again. Not by the county, not by the state, not by any development authority with a rubber stamp and a dream about tax revenue. The easement is permanent. It runs with the land. It will outlive Margaret, and it will outlive Ridgeline, and it will outlive whatever comes after Ridgeline. She signs her name 7 times across the document stack. Her handwriting is steady. Her hands don't shake. $6.2 million. For a strip of riverbank that Weston Drake once called scrubland attached to a dying operation. That dying operation just took his entire project to the mat. Now here's where it gets bigger than Margaret. Within 3 weeks of the settlement, the county's reclassification scheme starts unraveling. Not quietly, not behind closed doors. Publicly. Because Gene Sutter doesn't just file Margaret's case and move on. He files a formal challenge to the boundary methodology used across 11 properties in the river corridor. 11. All reclassified in the same 18-month window. All shifted from agricultural to commercial adjacent using the same flawed benchmark surveys. All benefiting the same development pipeline that Ridgeline needed clear. Other landowners start calling Gene's office. Ranchers, a couple who run a feed operation south of the bridge, an older man with 400 acres of bottomland who'd been told his parcel didn't qualify for agricultural tax status anymore. They'd all gotten the same letters, the same pressure, the same condescending visits from county officials telling them their land wasn't worth what they thought it was. Margaret's case is the precedent. Her boundary challenge, her original survey, her proof that the pins were moved, it cracks the whole thing open. 3 families file within the first month, 4 more by Christmas. The Pryor County Development Authority is suddenly answering questions it never expected to answer. And Weston Drake, the man with the slicked back hair and the charcoal overcoat and the white smartphone permanently welded to his right hand, the man who stood on Margaret's property and told her the county had already decided, the man who looked at a 68-year-old woman with calloused hands and a dead husband's legacy and saw nothing but an obstacle to bulldoze. He resigns. No press conference, no statement, no defiant op-ed in the county paper about being unfairly targeted. Just a 1-line letter to the board, effective immediately. That's it. Weston Drake, who puffed his chest and tilted his chin and leaned back on his heels like he owned every room he walked into. Gone. A single sentence and a signature.